When was the last time you quietly observed a stranger and wondered where they were from? How their days might be filled with child rearing, money-making, travel, unlived dreams, worries, ambitions. It's funny, isn't it, that we come across so many other people on a daily basis, and what we actually see or know about them is just a tiny fragment of who they truly are. Unfortunately, the same tends to happen in our conversations, even with those we know. Yet sometimes in conversations, something unexpected happens. Not a disagreement, not a debate, something quieter and far more disorienting. Something that makes us suddenly aware of all that unspoken and unknown. Something that invites us to more fully arrive.
I can say Buzurgo ki manas ki shukre, which means I'm so grateful for the precious gifts and the trusted gifts that my ancestors have passed through me, into me, and are with me. I am the mother of Hannah and Zara and Miriam, 3 girls. I have been community organizing since the age of 9. My dear dada, we lived on a convent cooperative, and I was there for the biscuits, of course. But I learned something about being in this way of community here in the West, and I went on to political organizing, and then I became quite obsessed with body and brain, learning, development, trauma, all of that work.
This is the voice of Skeena Rathor, this month's guest, who alongside decades of political activism, co-founded the vision and guardianship of Extinction Rebellion. Extinction Rebellion is a movement that uses non-violent, direct action and civil disobedience to persuade governments to act justly on climate and ecological emergency. We invited Skeena as our guest, as she and Rob are old friends, and we wanted to get her thoughts on our subject of exploration for this series, namely the myths of progress. We started our conversation in the same way as we did with Sue, Adie, and Mariah, by reading the quote from Margaret Wheatley's Who Do I Choose to Be? However, our conversation took a different turn, and what you will hear is an exploration of the themes that naturally emerged. You may have noticed she didn't introduce herself the way many of us in the West are used to. No elevator pitch, no curated title, just a quiet invocation of ancestry and place. It caught us off guard, and in the best way. It invited us to pause, to notice how quickly we rush to define ourselves, and to consider what we leave out when we lead with a resume. As she continued, it became clear that her path wasn't just political. It was spiritual, embodied, and deeply relational. Here's how she described what that journey has become.
It took me from many heart prayers, a kind of a Sufi way by the time I reached 40, around understanding the meaning of coherence for political change and what that needed. And then we formed something called Being the Change and Co-Liberation, which is a way of repairing our matricultural ways, repairing our arrival system of the body, and a way of expanding the capacity of the heart. So that in our Sufi culture, we say we are here to have a heart that can hold the world. So that's my mission. That's who I am.
This relational character became a thread that wove itself through every part of our conversation with Skeena, and it impacted and challenged both Rob and I quite strongly.
When I enter into a relationship, which can be through conversation, I'm entering in with you with an assumption of how this culture does it. And it's immediately challenging for me as a Kashmiri Sufi. And there we are, right there we are, because I feel like my immediate response is actually, how do I be here in my who-ness, my wholeness and my who-ness of who I am with you, making space for who you are and where you are from, your cosmology, your cultural way of being. And when we enter into a feeling together, sense making together, which is, I guess, what you're asking me to do, I'm immediately challenged by that, by the assumption that we're going to speak in a way that is of this culture.
By bringing her courage to this opening reflection, Skeena helped us realize how many implicit assumptions are in our own conversations, and how those assumptions can take away from our ability to really be available to the whole person sitting in front of us.
So that comes first. And then, because you are asking me that immediately, and I want to meet you there because I'm interested in our relationship, I want to say I am so grateful for Margaret's work. I actually used it in our co-liberation thinking when we talked about islands of sanity, sanctuary, and sanctity. I added on 2 extra things to her inspiration. And I'm glad that I'm so glad for her willingness and her courage in calling out and calling in this, what feels like the labor and the dis-ease of progress, as seen by modernity. So that's my initial connection to this.
Part of me wants to gently ignore the second part of your conversation and go back to the first bit, because I think there was something really interesting around, and I'm really curious about you saying about the assumption that we're going to have a conversation from our world.
Yeah.
That means I'm really interested in that, because I think for me that's part of this conversation.
I think for a lot of people of more melanin and outsider cultures, we're hiding a part of ourselves in order to show up as we're expected to show up. And that's tragic, because it means loss of relationship in its eventuality. And it's a lot to bear for all of us in the energy that we will share, because it will be here. So thank you for asking about that, Rob. Does that, I wonder how that feels for you. And Evelyn, I wonder how that feels for you to hear that. It's a lot, that's a weighty sharing.
I love that, because that's what it felt like. You were creating this bridge for us, and I felt quite humbled by it as well, because I thought, wow, what is it in me, for example, that doesn't acknowledge that's a place to start always in every new relationship and in every new conversation, is just to see, where do we build these bridges?
My heart feels tender. I'm with a lot of grief that much of my life I ran by the rules of this paradigm and what it determines to be relational and what it determines relationship as. Because, I want to show, I was taught to show up as, well, I am the granddaughter of, and I want to presence my ancestors in this reverent way.
At this point, I began to wonder how often I had been in the room with people who had not felt entirely welcome, who were hiding parts of themselves just to play by the rules. I wondered how often I was doing the same. Did I even know what it meant to fully arrive with someone I was just meeting for the first time?
And identify myself in a way that is generous and compassionate and respectful of our needs to know each other. Human beings, we have of this innate need in terms of looking for safety to identify the other first. Who is this human being, right? And what does this human being need to arrive? The arrival state, I sometimes call it, which people call the parasympathetic nervous system, right? What do we need to arrive? Well, we immediately need to be able to know that I'm safe enough with you.
Now, even though I'm a neuroscientist, and I know how important the parasympathetic nervous system is to form connections with others, I never really reflected on this idea of creating enough space for people to fully arrive. Skeena's words got both Rob and I reflecting deeply, wondering whether our ancestral connections offer the safety needed to shift into an arrival state.
I've actually thought about this quite a lot, about how, the lineage, and I get caught in something around the trauma that is represented in that lineage. So I think, and how do I introduce myself to people? And I know there's the cliche around, well, especially in the European culture, often people answer that question by what they do, and I understand that. But also, I wonder sometimes if I almost inadvertently say, well, this is what I do and this is where I'm headed, this is where I'm going. Do you know what I mean? Which all of a sudden takes me out of the present relationship into something beyond.
That just feels beautifully honest. And yeah, Evelyn, I'd love to hear how this is for you.
Well, I'm carrying a real sense of sadness, which is really interesting because I think, oh, wow, I wonder if you've just pointed at one of the struggles that I feel almost on a daily basis when I go into conversation or relationship with people, is this, I'm not sure how to identify myself, because I've always struggled with this identification with here's what I do, because I feel like that doesn't resonate with something in my essence. It's not about this thing that I do. And, I feel like I carry the landscape and the culture of the South American world that I was raised in more strongly than I do my Dutch heritage. And I know that it's a balance of both. But if I were to introduce myself with reverence to my relationships, I would probably bring in the trees and the horses that I spent most of my young days with.
Wow. Blessings. Blessing. Evelyn, can I respond? Is that okay to pick that up? And of course. I want to actually start with, Rob, you were talking to the trauma and the grief that is in our lineages, because actually there's a story there of lost connections, right? Lost belongings, lost ways of being. Yeah. And there's a heartache that I am in with you for, especially my kin racialized as white, where not only is there this sense of lost, but there's also a sense of shame that can really shrink the presencing, the arrival. And again, what I'm longing is that we hold that together. Equally, Rob, I just want to let you know that there's something happens some activation happens when I say I'm a Kashmiri Sufi and the granddaughter of, and I wish to presence my ancestors. And then we give gratitudes for them. This is part of the why we work in liberation, in liberatory ways, because something isn't being allowed. Our relationships aren't being allowed. I guess I'm wanting to affirm that the grief that is that's so bound in us from our lineages, this story can unify us. It can reunify us. So I want that for us.
And then I keep thinking as we're talking, we're framing this a little bit around this thing of progress, which is somewhere forward, but actually but it sounds like the work is in the understanding of our lineage and our heritage and our culture, and how do we relate and build bridges around that now in the present. And almost the progress will take care of itself if we can learn to relate in those different ways.
I feel it as beauty, yes. Evelyn, how are you doing?
At this point, my silence, and likely the look on my face, must have given away the sense of cautiousness that was building in me. I was beginning to see how foundational this conversation was. How much of what I feel grief-stricken by in the world was being touched upon. Ever since I was a little girl, I couldn't understand how it is that humans do such devastating things to their environments, to other beings, to each other. And somewhere in this conversation, an insight began to grow about how we misunderstand how deeply connected we actually are, because, perhaps, of the pain that we've experienced. And here was Skeena inviting us to build a heart big enough to hold all of it, the connection and the pain. I feel like I'm listening to two elders have a conversation, to be honest. So I'm a little bit hesitant to jump in. But I do have a question for both of you. Because I love this idea. I mean, I get this really visceral and very strong image of, these islands of sanity and sanctity, and where people are really just coming to arrive together and to share these stories.
Yes.
And I wonder, in your experience, Skeena, and maybe in who you are and what you bring to life in the world, what do you feel needs to be at the bedrock of these places? How do we create a habitat where people land in this and make space for this and invite others to arrive and themselves?
I'm so grateful for your question, and I also want to pay homage to you sharing with us that there's a young one in you here, or the feeling that the young one is up, and that something is feeling less than, and that reminds me so much, Evelyn, of where I can feel less than, which is part of this conundrum, that predicament that we're in together. And I want to just hold that with care. For me, what you are bringing and the question you've just asked feels of real progress. And I really feel like the essentiality of your question, because I think you're asking about the essential conditions for life flourishing, and I'm feeling this word rematriation.
Skeena introduces these terms, rematriation, and later she will introduce the term cosmology, terms that are hard to understand and that we don't come across regularly. So we wanted to define them for you before we continue to listen to the conversation. Rematriation is a word that refers to the process of restoring balance, relationship, and right stewardship to people, communities, and cultures by reconnecting them with their original, often matriarchal, wisdom traditions. It's about returning not just physical items, but also spiritual, cultural, and relational wholeness, often through the lens of the sacred feminine or maternal principles. It's about bringing back values such as nurturance, interdependence, care, relationship, and communal well-being. In the work that is done in Rematriation, it's about healing divides by elevating wisdom traditions that honor life, land, and kinship rather than domination, extraction, or individualism. It's about acknowledging and undoing cultural theft and assimilation by honoring sovereignty, rights, and spiritual relationships with the land. When Skeena talks about our cosmologies, she's referring to an overarching term that describes all the ties that we have, the web of life that has formed us, that we are deeply interconnected with, but have somehow disconnected ourselves from in this culture of individuality. Let's continue to listen to what she has to say.
Cosmologies are, these song lines and storylines. They make meaning of the relationship of life, the interrelatedness, the interactions of life. They make meaning for us. These are, we all come from. And yes, of course, modernity really put a stake in the heart of that. And really, there's been such severing of our cosmologies, right? And so we say to one another, hey, there's a rematriation journey. It's a journey of remembering our cosmologies, connecting to our story and songlines and our practices, the many ways of meaning, sensing, and knowing that live within us. Audre Lorde talked about it as our manyness, we come with our manyness. And that's all part of this rematriation. Because if we are to enter into, if we are to stay, if Homo sapiens want to stay here, on this beautiful earth, we need to rejoin the web of life, right? We need to come in, as Pat McCabe calls it, to the hoop of life. And that means that it depends entirely on our capacity to relate and to be in relationship. It depends entirely on our approaching all sentient life and each other with wonder, awe, curiosity, imagining and risking and exploring what might be if we connect this to that and this aspect to that aspect and one to another, right? Relatedness is why we're here. It's what delights and lights our hearts.
And I wonder whether what happens if we start to exchange the word progress for a little phrase that I've heard you use, and I've heard you use it before, Evelyn, about this is the place where life flourishes. That's what it's to do with. It's how do we create things where life flourishes? Wow. I have felt really moved today. Felt myself really tearful. Something about what is it like for us to be seen and to bring in our uncertainty and our nervousness and our caution about how do we do this welcoming from different cultures and different traditions. How do we do that? I feel really by that and really touched by it. So really, really grateful Skeena, for what you've brought today. I'm really, really honoured and challenged and encouraged and lots of things.
Just blessings with you, dear hearts, just so many blessings. Jai Ma, we can say, pray be to the mother. Thank you so much.
Our conversation with Skeena left many things stirring inside our hearts and our spirits. I started to notice and slow down more often when entering into a conversation with someone. I began feeling all the relationships that I carry with me wherever I go. Rob continued to explore his ancestry, and he wrote a beautiful poem to honor our conversation with Skeena. We will leave you with this poem, and we invite you to reflect on your own interrelatedness with the web of life.
Arrival. The old weathered door swings lazily in the mid-western breeze. I place my leathered foot into the widening and narrowing so it can't close fully, and I open gently to the sea that is before my eyes. I feel the mystery that hangs in the space set between us, and search for signs of the daily miracles lived within your rooms, for the stories told around your table, for the dreams hidden warm in the covers of your sleep. I have stepped onto your threshold, yet your life is hidden by the dust that floats within my eyes. I turn to leave, choose to let our worlds pass by untouched. But in that leaving moment, my nose is twitched by the smell of paprikaed soup. It floats from stove across well-loved kitchen and greets me where I stand, once again leaning in toward your welcome. You don't turn to face me straight, but I know you see me, that you expect to share your food with me. You place bread and cheese next to steaming bowls of acceptance. Then sit and slowly eat. No words spoken, no judgment of my dirty clothes and threadbare stare, no gaze forced upon my quizzical expression, no request to join you, just an unspoken invitation into arrival. And arrive I do. I let the door close behind me, throw my faded knapsack on the floor, and place my tattered coat on the old grey stand. I have a story spill course after course until we are content with each other's lives, filled with the richness of another's world.
Thank you for listening to this podcast episode with us. If you're interested in finding out more about what we do at Space to Be Human, please make sure to visit our Substack channel. There you will find articles, poems, coaching offerings, workshops that Rob and I give, and also the unedited versions of some of our episodes. We hope to see you next time.